Picture a road not made of asphalt or stone, but of whispered secrets and shifting sands, a path where caravans carried more than silk and spices, but the weight of empires, the shadows of forgotten crimes, and the echoes of lives traded like currency. This was the Silk Road, a name that conjures images of glittering treasures and exotic lands, but beneath its romantic veneer lay a network drenched in darkness. It wasn't just a route for commerce, it was a corridor of power, a theater of betrayal, and a graveyard of ambitions. From the bustling markets of Chang'an to the smoky taverns of Constantinople, every mile held stories that history books often gloss over, tales of greed, plagues that decimated nations, and civilizations erased without a trace. Think of the merchants who vanished without a whisper, their bodies swallowed by deserts or left to rot in mountain passes. Envision the slaves dragged across continents, their fates sealed by the whims of warlords and kings. The Silk Road was a paradox, a bridge between worlds, yet a weapon of conquest. It spread ideas, yes, but also diseases that wiped out millions. It connected cultures, but at what cost? Behind every bolt of silk or sack of pepper, there were deals struck in blood, secrets bartered like goods, and knowledge so dangerous it had to be buried. This was a place where even the air seemed to hum with treachery, where the line between explorer and conqueror blurred into oblivion, and now we're pulling back the veil. This journey won't be the sanitized version you've heard before. We're diving into the shadows where the Silk Road's true legacy lies. How did a single route become the lifeline of empires and the downfall of others? Who were the ghosts behind the gold, the voices silenced by time? From the black markets trading in human lives to the plagues that leaped from caravan to kingdom, these are the stories that shaped our world in ways you've never imagined. Strap in. By the end, you'll see history's most famous trade route in a light so stark, it'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. The gleaming caravans and bustling markets of the Silk Road hide a chilling foundation: bones. Not just the bones of beasts of burden, but of people. Enslaved laborers were the invisible hands that carved paths through jagged mountain passes, hauled stones for bridges, and died nameless in the scorching desert sun. Recent excavations near Dunhuang revealed rusted iron shackles still clamped around skeletal wrists, buried just beyond the lantern-lit taverns where merchants haggled over silks. These weren't isolated tragedies. Along the Tarim basin, mass graves tell a grisly tale, bodies stacked like firewood, many with spines twisted from decades of crushing loads. The slave trade wasn't incidental to the Silk Road, it fueled it. Prisoners of war, kidnapped victims, even entire villages sold into bondage by debt became the human machinery of empire. Persian records describe caravans where 2/3 of the cargo were people, their worth calculated alongside spices and jewels. In Samarkand, children as young as 8 were auctioned to work the mines, their small hands prized for digging lapis lazuli out of narrow tunnels. And when the Roman elite draped themselves in Chinese silk, they rarely asked whose blood stained the threads. The myth of the Silk Road as a peaceful cultural exchange shatters here. Those iconic routes through the Taklamakan Desert follow the chains, the grandeur of caravanserais. Listen for the whip cracks echoing behind the music. This was an economy built on stolen lives, where progress marched forward on broken backs. Archaeologists now trace the route not by pottery shards or coin hoards, but by unmarked graves, silent witnesses to history's greatest open secret. The Silk Road didn't just transport silks and spices, it became the deadliest highway in human history, a superhighway for the apocalypse. When the Black Death erupted in the 1400s, it didn't creep slowly across continents, it raced, riding the same caravans that carried luxury goods. Infected fleas hidden in bales of fur or nestled in the fur of rodents hitched rides from one oasis to the next, turning bustling trade hubs into charnel houses. The same routes that forged empires now delivered their doom, Take Sarai, the glittering capital of the Golden Horde, where merchants from Venice to Beijing once bartered under golden domes. When the plague arrived, it didn't just kill, it erased. Chronicles describe streets piled with corpses, left to rot because there was no one left to bury them. Within months, a city of 200,000 became a necropolis, its markets silent, its palaces choked with dust. The Mongol postal system, a marvel of efficiency that once sped messages across continents, now carried death warrants in the form of contaminated parcels. Even the Khan's armies, the terror of Eurasia, collapsed as soldiers dropped mid-march, their bodies left to bloat in the sun. But the horror wasn't just in the scale, it was in the speed. The plague moved faster than any army, outpacing rumors of its coming. By the time a village heard whispers of illness, it was already too late. In Crimea, Genoese traders fleeing infected ports unknowingly carried the plague to Constantinople, where it leaped to ships bound for Europe. The result, a death toll so vast it reshaped the globe, wiping out half of Florence, emptying Paris of its thinkers, and leaving farmland from Egypt to England littered with skulls. Modern DNA studies confirm the grisly truth. Strains of the plague buried in Silk Road graves match those found in mass graves from London to Beijing. This wasn't coincidence, it was logistics. The very networks that made the Silk Road a wonder of connectivity made it the perfect vector for annihilation. And while history remembers the silk and porcelain, the road's darkest export was written not in ledgers but in bones. Whole civilizations crumbled because of what traveled alongside the treasures, a reminder that progress and peril often walk the same path. Beneath the glittering veneer of silk and gold, the Silk Road harbored another thriving black market, one that altered minds instead of wardrobes. Long before modern drug cartels, ancient traders smuggled opium, cannabis, and hallucinogenic plants alongside cinnamon and pearls. Persian medical texts from the 9th century describe entire oasis towns gripped by addiction, their streets filled with listless users who traded family heirlooms for another dose of the joy plant. In Bukhara, physicians warned that opium imported from Mesopotamia and Afghanistan was ravaging communities, leaving craftsmen too debilitated to work and soldiers too weak to lift their swords. The trade was shockingly organized. Merchants disguised opium resin as lumps of amber or sealed it in hollow bamboo rods, while cannabis traveled in bundles marked as medicinal herbs. Tax records from Kashgar reveal how officials turned a blind eye for a cut of the profits, allowing caravans to transport hundreds of pounds of narcotics under the guise of sacred temple offerings. But the consequences were devastating. A 10th century account from Merv describes an entire quarter of the city abandoned to addicts, its once bustful workshops now echoing with the cries of children begging for food while their parents lay stupefied on dirt floors. Even royalty wasn't immune. Sogdian chronicles tell of a king who bankrupted his treasury buying smuggled opium, his court reduced to pawning crown jewels to feed his habit. Meanwhile, Buddhist monks along the Tarim basin wrote of monasteries where cannabis-laced tonics, meant to aid meditation, spiraled into rampant abuse. The Silk Road didn't just spread goods, it normalized vice on an industrial scale, creating the world's first transnational drug epidemic. And like the plagues that traveled its routes, this scourge left no kingdom untouched. From the pleasure gardens of Persia to the imperial courts of China, addiction became the shadow price of connectivity, proving that some trades cost far more than gold. Somewhere in the shifting sands of the Taklamakan, a single sandal lies half buried, its leather still intact after centuries, a silent witness to the caravans that never made it. The Silk Road's most terrifying legends aren't about what traveled its paths, but what vanished along them. Entire merchant trains, sometimes hundreds strong, evaporated between oases, leaving no trace but the occasional sun-bleached bone or splintered cartwheel poking through the dunes. The Lopner region, nicknamed the Devil's Desert, became a graveyard where the sands whispered secrets of massacres and merciless storms. excavations there reveal nightmares frozen in time, circles of skeletons huddled together, their arms raised as if to ward off attackers, their mouths still gaping in silent screams. Some clutched daggers, others held empty water skins. Forensic analysis shows many died not from thirst but violence, skulls crushed by clubs, ribs snapped by arrows. These weren't accidents. Bandit kings like the infamous Karakush built empires on ambushes, targeting wealthy caravans heavy with jade and silver. Persian scrolls describe the Howling Ones, raiders who mimicked wolf cries to disorient travelers before striking. But nature was just as deadly. Sudden sandstorms called Karaburan could bury a train in minutes. A 19th century explorer found a perfectly preserved scene near Turpan. A mummified merchant still gripping his camel's reins, both suffocated under 12 feet of sand mid-stride. Even the geography conspired against travelers. Salt flats disguised as lakes lured the desperate to drink, only to poison them with briny water. The real horror. Many disappearances weren't random. Local rulers sometimes hired bandits as tax collectors, taking a cut of plunder in exchange for letting raids continue. The sands keep their secrets well. To this day, satellites spot the outlines of buried caravans under the dunes, ghostly shadows of those who gambled on the Silk Road's riches and lost. Their fates serve as a grim reminder. For every trader who returned with fortunes, countless others became part of the road itself. The Silk Road's grand bazaars displayed more than silks and spices. Their most lucrative commodity was people. In the shadow of Tang Dynasty, China's opulent palaces, slave markets thrived, where exotic captives from Persia, Sogdia, and even Africa were paraded like livestock. Emperors prized these foreign slaves as status symbols, paying fortunes for blue-eyed dancers or Nubian wrestlers to entertain their courts. A 9th century inventory from Chang'an lists a Samarkand girl traded for 6 bolts of silk and a chest of silver, her fate sealed with a merchant's wax seal on parchment. But the horror ran deeper. Along Constantinople's docks, boys as young as 6 were forcibly castrated to feed the Byzantine eunuch trade, their bodies broken to serve as perfect imperial servants. Arab chroniclers describe the screams echoing from makeshift surgery tents near Trebizond, where survival rates were so low that traders shipped extras to account for deaths. Those who lived fetched astronomical prices. Some eunuchs became powerful officials, but most spent lifetimes in silent servitude, their trauma buried beneath palace intrigues. Meanwhile, Roman nobles flaunted Silk Road slaves like exotic pets. Mosaics in Pompeii depict shackled Bactrians and Indians tending vineyards, their faces forever frozen in artisans' tile. Legal scrolls from Antioch reveal chilling details. Slaves branded with their owner's mark on the cheek, escapees hunted with dogs trained to scent foreign spices on their skin. The most chilling accounts come from Dunhuang's cave scrolls, which record mass kidnappings along the Tarim basin. Entire villages were snatched by raiders who sold them to passing caravans, the transactions scribbled casually alongside shipments of camels and dates. This wasn't just commerce, it was an industry of despair where human lives were appraised, discounted, and bartered with the same indifference as sacks of grain. The Silk Road didn't just connect cultures, it commodified them, turning flesh into currency for 1,000 years. The Taklamakan Desert holds more than buried treasures. It conceals the grisly remnants of humanity pushed to its most desperate edge. Ancient texts like the Xuanzang Chronicles recount caravans lost in the dunes, their survivors reduced to unspeakable acts. One account describes a merchant party trapped for weeks without water, their desperation escalating until they drew lots not for food, but to decide who would become it. Buddhist monks traveling the route wrote of finding campsites littered with human bones cracked open for marrow, their edges scored with knife marks. Even faith offered no refuge. One temple scroll tells of pilgrims who prayed together by day, then butchered each other by nightfall. Archaeology confirms these horror stories. Mummies exhumed near the Lulan ruins show grotesque evidence: rib cages pried apart with tools, femurs shattered to access the nutrient-rich center. One male corpse, preserved for over a millennium, still clutched a sliver of human finger bone between his teeth. Forensic analysis suggests some victims were likely still alive when the cutting began, their bones bearing the frantic scrape marks of struggle. The desert's brutal logic left no room for morality: starve or slaughter, perish or become predator. Perhaps most chilling are the accounts from surviving traders forced to rationalize their actions. A Sogdian merchant's letter, discovered in the Mogao caves, justifies eating his companions by claiming their spirits consented in dreams. Another describes roasting flesh over camel dung fires, the smell indistinguishable from lamb, a detail so visceral it haunts modern researchers. These weren't isolated incidents. Tax records from cotton reveal officials tracking meat shortages along certain routes, a chilling euphemism for the unspeakable. The Taklamakan didn't create these horrors, it merely exposed the fragility of civilization. When the sand stripped away every veneer of law and piety, what remained was raw survival. Today, the mummified evidence lies in museum cases, their wounds silent testimony to the Silk Road's cruelest truth. For some travelers, the greatest danger wasn't the desert, but the person huddled beside them in the dark. Beneath the dunes of the Taklamakan, the ruins of Lulan whisper a warning: a city that thrived on the Silk Road's riches, only to choke on its own greed. Once a bustling oasis, its canals brimming with water and streets lined with mulberry trees, Lulan's downfall came not from invaders but from its rulers' insatiable hunger. Ancient records reveal how officials ordered the relentless cutting of poplar forests to expand farmland, not realizing they were severing their own lifelines. As the trees vanished, the desert crept in. Springs dried up overnight, sand swallowed orchards whole. By the time the last well turned to dust, the city was already a tomb, its doors left ajar by families fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Centuries later, archaeologists probing Lulan's ruins uncovered something eerie: the sand-preserved bodies of its final residents, their faces frozen in panic. One mummy, dubbed the Lulan Beauty, clutches an empty water jug, her lips peeled back in a silent scream. But the real horror emerged when the dig teams began dying. In 1980, expedition leader Peng Jiamu vanished without a trace during a sandstorm, his notebook found years later with a frantic final entry: "The city is awake." Others succumbed to sudden illnesses, high fevers, organ failure, with no medical explanation. Locals swear the ruins are guarded by Chenmo, vengeful spirits of those betrayed by the land. Nia's fate was even grimmer. Satellite images show its grid of streets radiating from a central palace like spokes on a wheel, a design meant to flaunt wealth, now a monument to hubris. Tax records carved on wooden tablets detail how Nia's kings demanded impossible tributes of water, diverting entire rivers to fill ornamental ponds while farmers' fields withered. When the rivers shifted course, the elites fled, leaving behind vaults of untouched silk and jars of wine too heavy to carry. Modern excavators who breached the palace walls reported hallucinations, phantom laughter, the scent of rotting fruit, before suffering strokes or vanishing on solo expeditions. The cruel irony: these cities weren't destroyed by war or plague, but by their own rulers' refusal to see beyond gold and silk. Today, their ruins stand as stark reminders. The Silk Road's greatest curse wasn't bandits or disease, but the poison of unchecked ambition. And if the whispers are true, some debts, even centuries old, are still being collected. The Mongols didn't just conquer cities, they weaponized despair. In 1346, outside the walls of Kaffa, a Genos trading post on the Black Sea, the Golden Horde unleashed a horror the world had never seen. Their soldiers, already dying from a mysterious disease, became living ammunition. With siege engines usually reserved for boulders, they hurled plague-rotted corpses over the walls, raining death into the streets. The stench alone was unbearable, a mix of spoiled meat and something darker, something alive. Within days, Kaffa's defenders were collapsing mid-battle, their skin mottled with grotesque black boils. This wasn't merely brutality, it was calculated genocide, the first recorded use of biological warfare in history. The tactic spread like the plague itself. As terrified Geno sailors fled Kaffa's doomed harbor, they carried more than silks and spices. Their ships became floating coffins, each rat-infested hull a ticking bomb. When they docked in Constantinople, then Messina, the invisible cargo leaped ashore. Within months, half of Europe was drowning in its own blood and pus, entire villages wiped out before neighbors even knew the sickness had come. The Mongols, masters of psychological terror, understood something terrifying. Fear travels faster than any arrow. A single infected body flung over a wall could doom a city without a single ladder raised. But the real horror lies in the paperwork. Surviving Mongol military scrolls detail the cold pragmatism behind the attacks. One commander's order, preserved in a Venetian archive, reads, "Let their own dead choke them." Another describes stacking corpses like grain sacks around besieged cities, knowing the stench would seep through even the thickest walls. This wasn't chaos, it was policy. Modern epidemiologists tracing the Black Death's path find its ground zero not in some natural outbreak, but in the siege camps of the Mongol army. The same trade routes that carried porcelain and philosophy had been twisted into delivery systems for annihilation. And the legacy, it never left us. Centuries later, during World War II, Japanese Unit 731 would crib from the Mongol playbook, dropping plague-infected fleas over Chinese villages. Today's bioterrorism drills still study Kaffa as the gruesome blueprint. The Silk Road's darkest innovation wasn't a spice or a fabric. It was the realization that commerce and carnage could share the same road, and sometimes the deadliest cargo wears a human face. The bustling markets of Samarkand once thronged with Sogdian merchants, their vibrant silks and quick tongues making them the envy of the Silk Road. By the 7th century, their language had become the trade lingua franca from China to Persia, their caravans the lifeline of empires. Then came the Arab conquests, not just a war, but a cultural erasure so complete it borders on the archaeological uncanny. When archaeologists unearthed the ruins of Panjikent, they found charred murals still showing laughing wine merchants and dancing goddesses, their faces slashed by swords before the fires finished the job. Beneath the soot, tax records in the Sogdian script lay half-melted, the ink blurred as if the very words were trying to flee the page. This wasn't just conquest, it was annihilation with precision. Arab chroniclers boasted of cleansing temples where Zoroastrian hymns had echoed for centuries, their altars smashed and replaced with hastily built mosques. In Bukhara, resistance leaders were crucified along the city walls, their bodies left to rot as a warning. But the real horror unfolded in the quiet spaces. Sogdian mothers teaching children to whisper their language only at home, merchants burning their own account books to avoid detection, entire neighborhoods abandoning their ancestral homes to blend into the conqueror's culture. A 9th century Arab geographer noted with chilling satisfaction that the Sogdian tongue had become a ghost sound, heard only in the hills where the last holdouts clung to their identity. Modern linguists piecing together the Sogdian language from surviving scraps face a macabre puzzle. One letter hidden in a Dunhuang cave ends mid-sentence, the writer likely interrupted by raiders. Another, found near Termes, contains a desperate plea for help from a merchant whose children had been taken as tribute. The script itself tells the story of erasure. Later documents show Arabic words creeping in like invasive species, until eventually the native script vanishes entirely. Even the Sogdians' famed art became a target. Murals at Afrasiab show eyes gouged out, hands amputated, an attempt to kill not just people but their way of seeing the world. The greatest insult lies in what replaced them. The same trade routes the Sogdians mastered became tools of their oblivion, as Arab governors rewrote history to cast them as primitive middlemen rather than the architectural geniuses who designed Silk Road hubs. Their irrigation systems were claimed as Arab innovations, their trading networks rebranded as Islamic triumphs. Today, UNESCO lists Samarkand as an Islamic city, its Sogdian roots reduced to a footnote. The sands that preserved Lulan's mummies swallowed Sogdian culture whole, leaving behind only fragments. A child's wooden doll here, a half-burned love poem there, whispering of a people who shaped the world, then were scrubbed from its memory. The caravans creeping through the Pamir Mountains didn't just fear bandits, they feared kings. The Kushan Empire's so-called shadow princes ruled not from gilded thrones, but from fortresses carved into cliffs, their wealth built on a simple, brutal economy. Every merchant who passed through their domain paid in silk, silver, or blood. These weren't petty thieves, but aristocrats of piracy, commanding fleets of raiders who could vanish into mountain fog like ghosts. Chinese chronicles describe their stronghold near Tashkoghan as the Eagle's Nest, a labyrinth of caves stocked with plunder, sacks of Roman gold dust, Indian rubies the size of pigeon eggs, and jars of Persian wine so potent it was said to drive men mad. The shadow princes didn't just steal, they engineered scarcity. By strangling key passes like the Wakhan corridor, they could triple the price of jade or saffron overnight, forcing desperate traders into their protection rackets. A Sogdian merchant's letter, hidden in a clay pot for 17 centuries, recounts how Kushan agents would slit the throats of every 10th camel in a caravan, then demand payment for safe passage. Those who refused found their entire shipment dumped into glacial ravines, a warning to the next train. Even emperors paid tribute. Hand diplomats grudgingly recorded delivering gifts of iron weaponry to the princes, knowing the alternative was severed trade routes and starved cities. Legends whisper of their hidden vaults. Tajik shepherds still report finding caves near the Afghan border stacked with skeletons in rotting silks, failed treasure hunters who chased rumors of the prince's hoard. One tale tells of a cavern where stolen Buddhist statues were melted down into gold ingots, their divine faces still visible in the bars. Another describes a valley where raiders blindfolded prisoners before leading them to dig cache sites, then buried them alive with the loot. Modern expeditions using ground-penetrating radar have detected unnatural voids beneath the Pamirs, but the mountains guard their secrets well. The cruelest irony. The Kushan prince's reign collapsed not from external conquest, but from their own greed. Tax records show they became so addicted to plunder that they neglected agriculture, and when climate shifts dried up their valleys, even their stolen mountains of grain couldn't save them. Today, their ruins loom over the Silk Road like broken teeth, a reminder that no empire, no matter how ruthless, can thrive when its only harvest is despair. The Silk Road didn't just trade silks and spices, it trafficked in the divine, and men killed for a piece of it. Among the most coveted treasures were Buddhist relics, fragments of bone or ash said to belong to the Buddha himself. These weren't mere curiosities, they were political dynamite. When a Chinese monk claimed to have discovered the Buddha's parietal bone, a sliver of skull, in the 6th century, empires went to war over it. The Northern Zhou dynasty besieged the city of Chang'an for 18 months. Not for gold or land, but for the right to enshrine that single fragment in a pagoda. Soldiers starved, cities burned, and all for a relic small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The relic trade became a shadow economy of its own. Pilgrims whispered of monasteries where abbots sold authentic Buddha teeth by the dozen, carved from animal bones or the remains of executed criminals. A 9th century Tibetan scroll describes a caravan ambushed near Cotton. Its guards slaughtered over a casket later found to contain nothing but goat vertebrae dyed with saffron. But the real violence erupted when relics were verified. In Gandhara, 2 rival kings waged a decade-long war over a single tooth, each claiming their monks had visions confirming its legitimacy. The conflict only ended when a 3rd ruler seized it and built a fortress around the relic, posting archers to shoot anyone who approached without tribute. Meanwhile, in Dunhuang, the threat wasn't greed, it was annihilation. As Islamic armies advanced eastward in the 10th century, Buddhist monks sealed 40,000 manuscripts inside Cave 17, a hidden library untouched for centuries. These weren't just sacred texts, they were time capsules of doomed cultures, from Sogdian marriage contracts to Zoroastrian hymns. The monks who bricked up the entrance likely knew they'd never retrieve them. Some scrolls bear hastily scribbled curses warning looters of divine retribution, while others simply end mid-sentence, as if the writer heard the approaching hoofbeats of destruction. The relics and texts that survived did so through sheer luck or deception. Xuanzang, the legendary pilgrim, wrote of carrying Buddha's finger bone back to China, only for modern tests to reveal it was a sliver of deer antler. Yet even fakes shaped history. A single forged relic could topple dynasties, spark mass pilgrimages, or justify the sack of cities, the Silk Road's darkest truth. Holiness was just another commodity, and faith bled as easily as silk died in vats of crushed insects. The shimmering silks and painted faces of the Silk Road's elite concealed a slow death. Aristocrats who draped themselves in the finest fabrics or dusted their skin with celestial white powders never suspected the truth. They were poisoning themselves with every touch. Archaeologists examining Han Dynasty tombs made a ghastly discovery. Noblewomen buried in exquisite embroidered robes had arsenic levels in their hair 60 times higher than normal. Their beauty regimens were lethal alchemy. The coveted, snow-white complexion prized from Rome to Chang'an came from lead-based creams that seeped into the bloodstream, causing organ failure and madness. A first-century Roman poet even joked about wealthy matrons glowing in the dark from their toxic makeup, not realizing it was literal. The silks themselves were chemical time bombs. Merchants along the Taklamakan route treated fabrics with mercury solutions to prevent moth damage, creating gowns that leached poison through sweat. Persian court records describe queens suffering tremors and hallucinations after years of wearing enchanted Chinese silks that left blue residue on their skin. But the most damning evidence comes from Xinjiang, where imperial workshops employed hundreds of workers to dye fabrics with cinnabar, a mercury sulfide that turned textiles vivid scarlet. Excavations revealed mass graves of these dyers, their bones still stained vermilion, their skeletons twisted from chronic mercury poisoning. Even the luxury packaging was deadly. Residue tests on lacquered boxes from Sogdian markets show they were sealed with lead-based adhesives, contaminating the spices and perfumes inside. A Byzantine noblewoman's diary complains of violent stomach pains after using her prized dragon's blood lip rouge, Ano, where it contained realgar, an arsenic mineral mined from the same mountains as jade. The Silk Road's greatest irony: the more exquisite the item, the more likely it was laced with toxins. Wealth became a slow suicide, and for those who could afford it, every indulgence was a bargain with death. Modern lab tests on surviving artifacts reveal the staggering scale. A single Han-era hairpin contained enough lead to kill a child. A patch of Tang Dynasty brocade still emits mercury vapors 12 centuries later. These weren't isolated accidents, they were the cost of doing business. Merchants knew, artisans knew, but in a world where status was measured in rarefied luxuries, no one dared whisper the truth. The Silk Road didn't just transport goods, it perfected the art of selling extinction, one gilded death at a time. High in the rugged mountains of northern Afghanistan, crumbling columns topped with Corinthian capitals stand witness to history's strangest vanishing act. These are the ruins of Ai Khanum, once a thriving Greek city where soldiers of Alexander the Great built theaters under the Hindu Kush sun and inscribed Greek philosophy on Central Asian soil. But by the 1st century, these outposts of Hellenism had vanished, not with the clash of swords but in eerie silence. Their disappearance is one of the Silk Road's most haunting puzzles. What happened to the lost children of Alexander? When Alexander's armies marched east in the 4th century before the Common Era, they left behind more than conquests. They planted Greek culture in the heart of Asia. Greco-Bactrian kings minted coins showing Zeus alongside Zoroastrian fire altars, while local women wore delicate golden earrings depicting Athena. At Ai Khanum, archaeologists found gymnasiums where Greek youths exercised beside Buddhist stupas, and tax records listing olive oil shipments to temples honoring both Apollo and local river gods. This was no crude colonial outpost, but a sophisticated fusion, until it wasn't. The end came not with war, but with forgetting. By the time Chinese envoy Zhang Qian reached the region in the 2nd century before the Common Era, he reported only ruins and confused legends of fair-haired devils who once ruled there. Modern DNA studies add chilling context. Skeletal remains from Tilya Tepe show Greek genetic markers abruptly disappearing from the population around this time. Some scholars believe plague decimated the cities, while others point to climate shifts that turned farmlands to dust. But the darkest theory comes from Bactrian scroll fragments suggesting the Greeks were systematically purged. Their libraries burned, their bodies thrown into mass graves now buried beneath Afghan wheat fields. Yet whispers of their legacy persist. In the remote Pamir villages of Afghanistan's Wakhan corridor, ethnographers have documented children with startling green eyes reciting verses that eerily resemble Homeric hexameter. A nomadic tribe called the Nuristanis preserves oral histories of golden kings from beyond the mountains who taught them to forge steel. Even the Taliban's destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan carried an unconscious irony. Those statues bore distinct Hellenistic drapery, the last artistic echo of a people erased twice over, first by history, then by memory. The Greco-Bactrians' true fate may lie in a single chilling detail. At the ruins of Begram, French archaeologists found a hoard of Greek artifacts deliberately hidden, not looted but carefully sealed behind a false wall. The last prayer of a dying culture, a time capsule for a future that never came. Their silence speaks volumes. On the Silk Road, even the mightiest civilizations could vanish between one caravan's journey and the next, leaving only stones that stubbornly refused to tell their whole story. Beneath the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro lies a mystery that defies conventional history. Streets littered with chunks of fused green glass, bricks vitrified into slick, molten sheets, and skeletal remains contorted as if frozen mid-scream. These aren't the scars of ordinary fire or war, but eerily resemble the trinitite found at nuclear test sites. Ancient texts like the Mahabharata describe weapons that could burn the world with the brightness of 10,000 suns, leaving survivors with hair and nails falling out, symptoms chillingly similar to acute radiation poisoning. For decades, researchers have puzzled over whether these ruins hint at an unthinkable possibility. Did the Silk Road corridor harbor civilizations capable of harnessing or suffering atomic destruction? The vitrified zones stretch beyond Mohenjo-Daro. In the Taklamakan Desert, explorers have found patches of blackened sand fused into jagged obsidian-like slabs, while the ruins of Rajasthan's Kakrapar fortress contain walls melted into grotesque flowing shapes. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to lightning strikes or extreme heat from ritual fires, but the patterns don't match. Lightning leaves erratic, branching scars. These vitrified sections form precise, circular zones like blast radii. Even more unsettling, soil samples from these sites show uranium levels 5 times higher than the surrounding area. Could natural deposits explain it? Maybe, but then there's the skeletons. Forensic analysis of Mohenjo-Daro's remains reveals bodies dumped haphazardly in streets, some still clutching everyday objects, a child's toy, a potter's tool, suggesting instantaneous, unanticipated annihilation. Their bones show no signs of blade trauma or blunt force, yet exhibit a strange, crystallized texture under microscopes, consistent with rapid exposure to extreme heat. Nearby, a layer of ash contains pottery shards melted into a single mass, a phenomenon requiring temperatures upwards of 1,500 degrees Celsius. Natural fires rarely exceed half that heat. Skeptics point to alternative explanations. In 2012, geologists proposed that a meteor airburst, like the Tunguska event, could have generated the necessary heat. Yet no impact crater has ever been found near Mohenjo-Daro, and the vitrification isn't scattered randomly as a meteor's debris field would be, but concentrated in specific strategic areas: city gates, palace walls, and granaries. Even stranger, the vitrified zones align with ancient sewage systems, structures that would have held flammable gases. Some scholars speculate these could have been intentionally ignited as primitive thermobaric weapons, though no contemporary texts describe such technology. The most haunting clue might lie in the ruins themselves. Excavated tablets from Harappa depict mushroom-shaped clouds alongside fleeing figures, while a recovered seal shows a humanoid figure with multiple arms, interpreted by some as a stylized representation of radiation sickness. Whether these are symbolic or literal records remains fiercely debated. What's undeniable is that the Silk Road's myths and ruins share an uncanny vocabulary of destruction. From the fused stones of Mohenjo-Daro to the desert's radioactive whispers, the land itself seems to hold secrets modern science still struggles to decipher. Perhaps the darkest truth isn't whether ancient atomic warfare occurred, but how little we truly know about the forces that once shaped this world. In the shadow of the Alborz Mountains, a radical sect rewrote the rules of devotion until their faith turned fatal. The Mazdakites, followers of the fire-worshipping priest Mazdak, preached a doctrine so extreme it terrified even the most hardened Silk Road rulers. Their radical vision, the abolition of private property, the sharing of all wealth, and most shockingly, the sharing of wives. Persian chronicles describe Mazdakite villages where husbands and wives were reassigned by lottery, their children raised communally in what critics called the devil's experiment. But it was their final act that would sear their name into history as the Silk Road's most infamous suicide cult. When the Sasanian Emperor Khosrow I decided to purge the Mazdakites in 528, he expected resistance. What he got was something far darker. Cornered in their mountain stronghold near Rei, the sect's leaders made a chilling choice. They would leave this world on their own terms. Ancient sources describe a nightmarish scene. Hundreds of believers, clad in white robes symbolizing purity, formed concentric circles around a massive bonfire. As imperial troops scaled the cliffs, the Mazdakites began chanting not prayers for mercy, but a hymn to annihilation. Then, one by one, they stepped into the flames. The Byzantine historian Procopius, never one to shy from drama, wrote that the fire burned so bright it outshone the dawn, its glow visible from 3 days' march away. More disturbing are the details from surviving converts. Scroll fragments found in a Tabriz monastery describe how Mazdakite children were given the cup of liberation, a drink laced with lethal poisons before the mass immolation began. Others tell of elderly followers who slit their own throats rather than face capture, their blood staining the sect's sacred texts crimson. Archaeology confirms the horror. Excavations at the site in the 1980s revealed charred bone fragments fused with melted gold jewelry victims who'd adorned themselves for their fiery exodus. But the most macabre find, a stone cistern filled with skeletons showing no burn marks, their skulls bearing the telltale fractures of blunt force trauma. These weren't willing martyrs, they were the dissenters slaughtered by their own brethren to prevent desertion. The Mazdakites' legacy is a cautionary tale about extremism's slippery slope. What began as a movement for economic equality devolved into a death cult, its members so convinced of their righteousness that mass suicide seemed preferable to compromise. Their ashes scattered across the Silk Road as a grim reminder. Even the noblest ideals can curdle into madness when taken too far. Today, local shepherds still avoid the site after dark, whispering that on certain nights the ghostly chanting returns, an eternal echo of faith turned to fire. Beneath the windswept plains of Bulgaria and the crumbling cliffs of the Pamir Mountains, archaeologists have unearthed graves that defy ordinary burials, skeletons pinned through the chest with iron rods, their jaws wrenched open with stones, their heads severed and placed between their knees. These weren't victims of war or punishment, they were the Silk Road's so-called vampires, corpses subjected to rituals so extreme they crossed into horror. Medieval chronicles from both Europe and Asia tell of a shared terror that spread along the trade routes, the fear that some souls refused to stay dead, rising instead to spread plague and misfortune. The connection to disease was no accident. When the Black Death ravaged the 14th century, panicked villagers noticed something macabre. Graves of early victims often appeared disturbed, their shrouds torn, their bodies oddly preserved. We now know this was natural decomposition, but to terrified onlookers, it seemed proof the dead were crawling back to feast on the living. Byzantine physicians wrote of walking corpses whose breath could infect whole households, while Chinese scrolls described jiangshi hopping revenants that drained the life from travelers. The solution: brutal preventative measures. In Serbia, a skeleton from the 1300s was found with a sickle blade embedded in its ribs, positioned so any movement would disembowel the corpse. Along the Volga River, burials contained bodies face down, their spines snapped post-mortem to prevent rising. The most chilling discoveries come from Cappadocia, where entire families were interred together, their skulls smashed and mixed in a gruesome game of reassembly, a ritual meant to confuse the dead so they couldn't find their way back. But the most telling evidence lies in the timing. These vampire burials cluster along Silk Road trade hubs hit hardest by plague outbreaks, their methods varying by culture but sharing one grim purpose: stopping disease at its imagined source. A Mongolian shepherd's grave near the Altai Mountains held a corpse bound with ropes made from infected horsehair, while a Venetian merchant's skeleton in Crimea was buried with its mouth packed with garlic and mercury, ingredients then believed to purify corruption. Modern forensic work reveals the heartbreaking reality behind the legends. Many vampires were likely the first to die in their communities: children with telltale plague scars, women showing signs of malnutrition, their bodies treated as patient zeros of supernatural contagion. The Silk Road didn't just transport silks and spices, it carried terror in its wake, turning grief into something monstrous. Today, these graves stand as dark monuments to humanity's oldest instinct. When faced with the inexplicable, we'd rather blame the dead than accept our own fragility. High in the remote monasteries of the Himalayas, where prayer flags flutter against endless skies, whispers persist of a practice so taboo it stains the very concept of enlightenment. Tantric Buddhist sects in medieval Tibet weren't just meditating, they were allegedly consuming the dead. The so-called Black Book of Shambhala, a collection of controversial manuscripts hidden for centuries, describes rituals where monks would carve flesh from corpses during secret moonlit ceremonies, believing the act would absorb the deceased's spiritual power. These weren't desperate survival measures, but calculated acts of devotion or sacrilege, depending on who tells the tale. The most infamous account comes from a 19th-century Nepalese explorer's journal, detailing a visit to a cliffside monastery near Mustang. He described walking into a chamber where skulls served as bowls, their interiors still slick with fatty residue. Frescoes on the walls depicted figures feasting on human limbs, their mouths stained red with pigment made from crushed cochineal insects, or so the monks claimed. But the real horror lay in the cellar: rows of preserved cadavers, their organs carefully removed, their muscles scored with ritual knife marks. When confronted, the head lama reportedly shrugged, saying, "The body is but a vessel." Why waste wisdom when it can be ingested? Skeptics argue these stories are exaggerations, twisted by outsiders who misunderstood tantric symbolism. After all, Tibetan sky burials, where corpses are dismembered for vultures, were already grotesque to foreign eyes. But forensic evidence adds weight to the claims. In 2012, carbon testing on ceremonial daggers from a ruined monastery near Mount Kailash revealed traces of human myoglobin, a protein found only in muscle tissue. Even more damning, a cache of letters between lamas discovered in a hidden alcove at Dunhuang debated the ethics of channeling the wrathful deities through consuming the 5 forbidden meats, with one scribe warning that initiates were losing their humanity in the chewing. The Black Book itself remains fiercely contested. Tibetan scholars dismiss it as a colonial forgery, while occultists hail it as a suppressed gospel. Its most chilling passage describes a ritual where monks would consume the tongue of a recently deceased master to steal his final words before they escaped to the wind. Whether literal or metaphorical, the text exposes a chilling truth. On the Silk Road's spiritual frontier, where cultures collided and dogmas blurred, even enlightenment had its price. And sometimes that price was paid in flesh. The rivers of cotton didn't run with water, they ran with jade, the translucent green stone coveted by emperors from Chang'an to Constantinople. But for every flawless gem pulled from the riverbeds, there was a corpse left to rot in the cliffs above. Miners called it mountain sickness, a cruel euphemism for the slow suffocation that came with hacking jade from the earth. The real killer wasn't the pickaxes or the collapsing tunnels, but the dust-fine particles of silica that lodged deep in the lungs, turning them to stone. Workers would cough up bloody froth within months, their chests rattling like gravel-filled sacks. By the time their fingers turned blue from lack of oxygen, the overseers had already replaced them with fresh hands from the slave markets. The Cotton Kings guarded their jade monopoly with psychotic precision. 7th century Tang dynasty records describe how caravans carrying raw jade had their entire crews executed upon delivery to prevent them from divulging mining locations. One particularly paranoid ruler, King Vijaya Sangrama, went further. He ordered the tongues cut out of every miner who worked the primary veins, then had them thrown back into the pits as living scarecrows. Their mute, dying forms served as a warning to newcomers. The secret of the jade fields was worth more than human life. Even the geography conspired to kill. The most precious mutton fat jade came from deposits at 15,000 feet in the Kunlun Mountains, where thin air left laborers gasping before their lungs even began to fail. Buddhist scrolls from Dunhuang tell of entire work gangs freezing to death overnight, their stiffened fingers still clutching chunks of uncut stone. But the most damning evidence comes from the mines themselves. Modern explorers found tunnels where skeletons were deliberately entombed, not by cave-ins but by human hands. Some corpses still wear iron collars chained to the rock, their bones arranged in postures of agonized struggle. The irony was exquisite. This was the stone of immortality, the material Chinese alchemists ground into powders to cheat death. Emperors slept with jade pillows to ward off decay, never suspecting each smooth surface carried the ghosts of those who died coughing up their own lungs. Today, satellite images reveal thousands of abandoned pits pocking the cotton landscape like open sores, a testament to the Silk Road's most toxic paradox. The very stone meant to symbolize purity and eternity was mined in hells so vile, even the mountains couldn't bear to remember them. Marco Polo's travelogues paint a scene straight from a nightmare caravans winding through the Taklamakan desert with corpses lashed upright to their camels, the dead swaying alongside the living like grotesque passengers. According to his dubious but chilling account, some Silk Road merchants couldn't afford to bury their companions in the shifting sands, so they preserved the bodies with salt and tied them to pack animals, dragging them for hundreds of miles until they reached a town where burial fees were cheaper. The practice allegedly earned these ghastly processions a grim nickname, the Walking Dead Roads. But was this macabre caravan ritual real or just another of Polo's embellished tales? Forensic archaeology offers unsettling clues. Along the Lop Desert's corpse roads, excavators have found mummies with tendons still intact. their limbs unnaturally stiff consistent with deliberate preservation, whether by salt or rudimentary embalming. Even more telling are the artifacts, coins sewn into shrouds, a custom linked to paying spirit tolls for proper burial in Zoroastrian and Buddhist traditions. A 13th century Persian medical manual even details a paste of natron and resin used to harden the flesh for long journeys, suggesting some form of corpse transport was at least technically possible. Yet the darkest truth lies in the economics. Burial taxes along the Silk Road weren't just steep, they were predatory. Kashgar's municipal records show grieving families charged double for outsiders, while Samarkand's graveyards demanded a cut of the deceased's estate. For merchants already bleeding money from bandit bribes and customs fees, hauling a salted corpse might have been the only way to avoid leaving a comrade in an unmarked pit. One Sogdian ledger, stained with what might be blood, lists a payment for 6 camel loads of white powder, alongside an entry for brother's passage. The line between practicality and horror blurs when poverty dictates your dignity in death. Modern skeptics dismiss Polo's zombie caravans as fantasy, pointing out that desert heat would have liquefied untreated corpses within days. But recent experiments with ancient preservation methods tell a different story. When researchers applied a Tang dynasty embalming recipe salt, quicklime, and crushed pomegranate rind to donated cadavers in Xinjiang's arid climate, the bodies mummified within weeks, their skin hardening like leather. Add the Silk Road's documented obsession with spirit roads for the dead to return home, and Polo's account starts feeling less like exaggeration and more like a desperate solution to a brutal reality. The Taklamakan still guards its secrets. Locals swear that on windless nights you can hear the creak of ancient saddle straps and the muffled thud of camel hooves, sounds with no visible source. Whether ghost story or historical echo, it's a reminder that the Silk Road's legacy isn't just written in spice ledgers or treaty scrolls, but in the unquiet bones of those who never made it home. The Silk Road's caravans carried more than spices and silks. They smuggled love letters, secret trysts, and romances that could get you killed. Take the tragic tale of Anahita, a Persian princess who dared to love a Sogdian merchant. Court chronicles from Ctesiphon describe how her father, King Khosrow Roman II, discovered her affair when a silk ribbon embroidered with her lover's name slipped from her sleeve during a banquet. The punishment was swift and brutal. The merchant was flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and paraded through the bazaars as a warning, while Anahita was forced to drink a cup of molten gold, a fit end for a traitor who valued foreign filth over royal blood. Her final words, scribbled in charcoal on her prison wall, survive in a single fragment. The road giveth, the king taketh away. Even royal alliances forged through marriage often ended in treachery. The legendary Princess Wencheng of Tang China was sent to marry Tibet's King Songtsen Gampo in 641. Her dowry wagons groaning with Buddhist scriptures and silks meant to seal peace between empires. But the king's first wife, a Nepalese princess, saw Wencheng as a threat. Tibetan scrolls tell how she poisoned Wencheng's favorite maidservant, then framed her for witchcraft. When Songtsen Gampo found a crudely made doll stuck with needles hidden under Wencheng's bed planted evidence, he ordered her confined to a freezing mountain palace. She died years later, her fingers blackened by frostbite, still scratching prayers into her cell walls. The cruelty wasn't limited to royalty. Along the Tarim basin, a Kashgar silk weaver's ballad tells of a Aigha girl named Isla who fell for a Nestorian Christian trader. When her family discovered his cross hidden in her dowry chest, they stoned her to death on the steps of the local mosque. The trader returned to find her body sewn into a felt shroud, the traditional punishment for polluting the bloodline. He hanged himself from a caravanserai gate, his suicide note written in Syriac. No road is long enough to outrun hatred. These weren't isolated tragedies. Byzantine tax records from Antioch list special fines levied on mixed marriages. while a 9th century Samarkand judge's diary details 19 executions for cross-border fornication. The Silk Road connected a dozen cultures, but its greatest taboo remained the human heart. Love, more than any plague or bandit, was the cargo empires feared most because it couldn't be taxed, controlled, or silenced. Even now, archaeologists uncover poignant relics of these doomed romances. A silver locket from Merv containing 2 braided hairs, one jet black, one golden. A Dunhuang cave painting of lovers embracing under a bridge, their faces scratched out by later hands. The road gave the world spices, religions, and languages, but for those who dared to love across its borders, the price was written not in silver, but in blood. The Gobi Desert holds more than bones and buried gold. It harbors legends of soldiers who never laid down their arms. Locals whisper of dust storms that take on unnatural shapes, swirling into the forms of armored men marching in perfect formation. These aren't just mirages. For centuries, travelers along the northern Silk Road have reported seeing phantom legions emerging from the dunes at twilight, their spears glinting in the dying light. The most chilling accounts come from a 19th century Russian explorer's journal, describing a column of warriors in Qin-era armor who materialized near Dunhuang, their silent ranks stretching farther than the eye could see. When he approached, his guide yanked him back, hissing that these were the Yin Bing, the shadow army of the first emperor, cursed to guard his treasures beyond death. Archaeologists have long dismissed these tales as superstition, until ground-penetrating radar revealed something unsettling. Beneath the Gobi's shifting sands near the known terracotta warrior pits, scans detected vast, hollow chambers arranged in military formation. But unlike the famous clay soldiers, these voids contain no statues, just strange metallic echoes that shift position between surveys. Some researchers speculate they could be natural caverns, while others point to ancient texts describing Emperor Qin Shi Huang's Second Army, a legion of live soldiers buried with him as insurance against rebellion. Han Dynasty records mention a mass disappearance of 6,000 convicts near the emperor's tomb, their fate never recorded. The legends grow darker the deeper you dig. Mongolian herders near the Altai Mountains swear they've found campsites littered with bronze arrowheads and rusted rations tins. Artifacts carbon dated to the Qin era, but bearing no signs of decay from sand or wind. One shepherd's account tells of stumbling upon a cave filled with skeletons still clutching weapons, their flesh strangely preserved. When he returned with officials, the cave had vanished, leaving only a smooth cliff face. Even modern technology fails to explain these phenomena. A 2016 Chinese geological survey team reported their compasses spinning wildly near the Gobi's ghost valleys, while infrared cameras captured cold spots moving in deliberate patterns, as if something invisible were patrolling. Perhaps the most haunting clue lies in the terracotta warriors themselves. Close examination of their armor reveals an anomaly. Some figures bear real human hair embedded in the clay, while others have skeletal fragments mixed into their mortar. Forensic tests confirmed these weren't later additions, they were baked into the statues from the beginning. A suppressed Tang Dynasty scroll describes Emperor Qin's sorcerers using the essence of the loyal dead to animate his clay army, binding souls to their ceramic shells. Whether myth or grim reality, the desert keeps its secrets. To this day, night patrols along the Gobi's edge report hearing the muffled clank of armor and the occasional whisper on the wind, not in Mandarin, but in Old Qin dialect, a language dead for 2 millennia. The Silk Road's greatest treasures may still be guarded, not by traps or locks, but by those who never received the order to stand down. High in the mist-shrouded temples of Japan's Yamagata prefecture, the air smells of incense and something far older. The faint, sweet rot of human flesh preserved not by embalmers but by sheer willpower. Here sit the Sokushin Batsu, Buddhist monks who transformed themselves into mummies through a ritual so grueling it makes medieval fasting saints look indulgent. Their process began years before death with a diet of nuts, berries, and toxic yoroshi tree sap, a poison that seeped into their organs, killing internal parasites and slowing decomposition. Then came the final act, entombment alive in a cramped stone chamber with nothing but a bamboo air tube and a bell to signal they still breathed. When the ringing stopped, the tube was removed, sealing their fate. Those whose bodies resisted decay were enshrined as living Buddhas. Those who failed were quietly forgotten, their skeletons left to gather dust in unmarked crypts. The practice wasn't limited to Japan. In Mongolia's Gobi Desert, tantric monks known as rainbow bodies pursued a similar path, starving themselves until their skin turned translucent, their organs atrophied. Legends claim the most adept could vanish entirely, leaving behind only hair and nails, a phenomenon modern scientists attribute to rapid desiccation in the arid climate. But the eeriest evidence lies in a remote temple near Ulaanbaatar, where a 17th-century lama named Dashi Dorjo Itagilov sits perfectly preserved without any artificial mummification. His skin remains supple, his joints flexible, as if he might open his eyes at any moment. Soviet scientists who examined him in the 1920s found no explanation for his condition, and to this day, devotees believe his consciousness lingers in a state of deep meditation. What drove these men to such extremes? Scrolls found in a Himalayan cave offer a clue. One monk's journal describes visions of demons overrunning sacred sites unless flesh becomes fortress. For others, it was the ultimate act of devotion, a rejection of the cycle of rebirth. But the darkest truth lies in the whispers of coercion. A 19th-century Japanese magistrate's report details how abbots pressured aging monks into self-mummification to boost temple prestige, with some candidates reportedly chained in their burial chambers to prevent escape. Today, these mummies stare out from glass cases with sunken eyes, their lips curled into enigmatic smiles. Pilgrims leave offerings at their shrines, praying for miracles, while scientists debate whether their preservation was spiritual triumph or slow-motion suicide. Either way, their legacy endures as the Silk Road's most unsettling paradox: men who sought eternal life through the meticulous orchestration of their own deaths, leaving behind bodies that refused to surrender to time. The Han Dynasty's court historians wrote with shaking brushes about the northern devils who drank from cups carved from the skulls of their enemies. These were the Xiongnu, the nomadic horse lords whose raids sent shockwaves through China's frontier, but their most horrifying weapon wasn't their arrows or cavalry. It was the deliberate cultivation of terror through rituals that turned warfare into theater. According to the Shiji, imperial envoys returning from Xiongnu camps reported feasts where captives were rendered like lambs, their bones fashioned into flutes and their scalps stitched into saddle blankets. One account describes a Chanyu, a Xiongnu king, toasting his generals from a gilded skull goblet, the original owner's jawbone still attached as a handle. Archaeology lends credence to these grim tales. Excavations of Xiongnu burial mounds in modern-day Mongolia reveal piles of human femurs split lengthwise, the marrow scraped out, a telltale sign of ritual cannibalism. Forensic analysis shows cut marks consistent with careful butchering, not battlefield chaos. But the most chilling find came from a noble's tomb near the Orkhon Valley. A set of 8 skull caps polished smooth, arranged around a bronze cauldron still caked with residue testing positive for human myoglobin. These weren't the acts of starving nomads but calculated displays of dominance. The practice wasn't isolated to the Xiongnu. Scythian tribes along the Black Sea crafted similar grisly trophies, with Herodotus recounting how warriors would drink from the skulls of vanquished foes to consume their courage. Far to the west, the Wusun people allies turned. Enemies of the Han were said to mix the blood of slain enemies with wine, a draught believed to transfer the victim's strength. Even China's own annals admit to reciprocating the horror. During the chaotic 16 Kingdoms period, a rebel general reportedly served Xiongnu prisoners as barbarian banquets to his troops, declaring they'd feast on fear itself. What modern scholars debate isn't the reality of these acts, but their purpose. Some argue they were psychological warfare, the equivalent of medieval heads on pikes. Others point to nomadic spiritual beliefs, where consuming an enemy's flesh prevented their ghost from seeking vengeance. The Book of Y offers a hauntingly practical explanation. In the brutal winters of the steppe, where famine shadowed every campaign, the line between ritual and sustenance may have blurred. A frozen Scythian mummy discovered in the Altai Mountains still clutches a dried human finger in its hand, its stomach contents revealing a last meal of horse meat and something disturbingly primate. The Silk Road's true horror lies in how casually such practices were documented. A Kushan merchant's ledger found near Taxila lists one skull cup, very fine, alongside shipments of lapis lazuli and cinnamon, valued at 12 silver drachmas. This was commodified terror, traded as dispassionately as silk or spices. For all the route's glory as a bridge between civilizations, it also carried the darkest appetites of humankind, proof that beneath the veneer of commerce and diplomacy, the old hungers never died. They simply learned to walk in daylight. Deep in the vaults of Dunhuang's sealed caves, where Buddhist sutras gathered dust for centuries, scholars whisper of another kind of text entirely, one never meant to see daylight. The Book of Silk wasn't woven from threads of gold or indigo, but from something far more dangerous, words that could bend nature itself. Tang Dynasty arrest warrants describe it as a nest of venomous characters, its pages allegedly scribed with inks mixed from scorpion venom and crushed meteorites. According to fragmentary court records, this grimoire contained incantations to summon sandstorms dense enough to bury caravans, recipes for poisons that mimicked heart failure, and most chillingly, rituals to ensure a rival's crops withered overnight while one's own fields flourished. What makes these rumors more than superstition? 3 separate Silk Road merchant diaries from the 8th century tell nearly identical stories. One Sogdian trader, writing in code, describes a competitor's entire warehouse collapsing after a mysterious stranger left a scrap of silk inscribed with the 18 crooked signs near its foundation. Another recounts how Ike, her noble's enemies, all developed bleeding gums and blackened fingernails after he displayed a peculiar banner outside his tent. But the most damning evidence comes from the ruined city of Gaochang, where archaeologists found a buried strongroom containing over 30 mummified bodies, their contorted postures suggesting sudden, agonizing deaths. Among them lay a half-burned scroll with faint traces of silver ink, its remaining characters matching descriptions of the Book of Silk's opening passage, "When the desert sighs, kingdoms fall." The Tang government's reaction was swift and brutal. Imperial edicts ordered every copy burned, offering rewards equivalent to a governor's annual salary for information leading to its destruction. A surviving interrogation transcript from 762 details the execution of a Nestorian Christian monk caught hiding a fragment in his Bible. His final words, according to the scribe, "The words were here before your empire, and they'll remain after." But whispers persisted. 4 centuries later, Marco Polo recorded a bizarre encounter near Kashgar where a blind fortune-teller accurately predicted a sandstorm's arrival by stroking a strip of fabric, blackened with age and something darker. Modern science offers unsettling explanations. Researchers analyzing residue on controversial artifacts like the infamous sandstorm jar from Turpan found high concentrations of barium and sulfur, chemicals known to create toxic fumes when heated. A 2019 study even demonstrated how specific low-frequency chants could destabilize loose sediment, triggering mini-avalanches. Whether the Book of Silk held genuine power or merely exploited fragile ecosystems, its legacy endures in Silk Road ghost stories. Locals still warn travelers not to pick up antique silk scraps bearing strange markings, especially those that seem to whisper when the wind blows just right. The Silk Road's oases didn't just quench thirst, they became instruments of annihilation. When Timur the Lame, history's most brutal tactician, besieged a city, he didn't just slaughter its people, he murdered its future. His armies dumped cartloads of salt, arsenic, and rotting corpses into wells, ensuring even survivors would wither from within. The siege of Isfahan in 1388 left such devastation that Persian chroniclers wrote of earth so toxic even weeds refused to grow, and babies born years later still suffered twisted limbs from tainted groundwater. This wasn't warfare, it was ecological genocide. Archaeologists tracing Timur's path find the scars still visible. Near the ruins of Damascus, soil samples show sodium levels 10 times higher than surrounding areas, while in the Fergana Valley, wells abandoned 6 centuries ago still test positive for lead and mercury. The worst evidence lies in the Aura Sea Basin, where entire lakes turned to poisonous sludge after Timur's engineers diverted rivers to drown rebellious cities, then left the stagnant waters to fester. Modern farmers there whisper of cursed plots where crops blacken overnight, unaware their ancestors' water was laced with enough arsenic to linger for millennia. The strategy spread like a virus. Mongol generals adopted it during their sack of Baghdad, dumping libraries of medical texts into the Tigris until the ink turned the river black, a symbolic and literal poisoning. Chinese dynasties perfected subtler methods, bribing caravan guides to lead rivals to sweet springs, spiked with slow-acting herbs that induced paralysis. A Tang military manual recovered from Turpan details recipes for thousand-year wells, brewed from crushed centipedes and aconite, guaranteed to leave land barren for generations. The cruelty lay in its permanence. While burned cities could be rebuilt, toxified land sentenced survivors to slow starvation. A Byzantine envoy's report from 1420 describes mothers near Samarkand grinding bones from mass graves to make ghost bread, their fields yielding only stunted, metallic-tasting grain. Even now, satellite imagery reveals eerie patterned circular dead zones where ancient wells once flowed, their poison seeping outward like dark halos. The Silk Road's greatest tragedy wasn't just the lives it took, but the futures it stole, leaving Earth itself to remember what empires tried to erase. The Fergana Valley's prized horses weren't just fast, they were infamous. Ancient Chinese scrolls call them Zuyin Ma, blood-drinking steeds, their flanks streaked with rust-colored markings that looked perpetually stained. To the Han Dynasty, these were the ultimate war machines, bred not just for speed but for something far darker, a taste for human flesh. According to the Shiji, General Lai Guangli's disastrous expedition in 104 before the Common Era encountered herds that bit like wolves, their teeth filed to ragged points by Fergana trainers. When scouts disappeared near the Sadaria River, their remains showed not just trampling wounds but precise incisions along the limbs, as if something had grazed before killing. This wasn't mere legend. Skeletal evidence from a mass grave near Kok and reveals horses buried alongside human bones bearing distinctive crescent-shaped gouges, matching the dental structure of Fergana breeds. One skull still clenched a bronze bit between its teeth, the metal warped from unnatural pressure. Persian military manuals from the same era detailed training methods that would make modern equestrians recoil. Foals raised on meat-soaked grain, then starved before being loosed on bound prisoners. A Sasanian cavalry officer's diary describes how the scent of blood could send these mounts into frenzy, their riders struggling to restrain them even after battles ended. But the most chilling account comes from a Greek mercenary's letter found in Bactria. He writes of watching Fergana nobles stage gruesome spectacles where condemned criminals were drenched in animal fat and set running across arenas only for the horses to chase them down, their instincts honed to view humans as prey. Some scholars argue these stories are exaggerations, conflating ordinary warhorse aggression with myth. Yet the archaeology tells another story. In 2009, a Kazakhstani dig uncovered a stable complex near Tashkent with iron rings bolted to the walls at jaw height, their surfaces grooved from constant gnawing. The cruel genius of these practices wasn't just psychological warfare, it was economic. Fergana breeders commanded prices equivalent to a lord's ransom for their demon mounts, trading them along the Silk Road to warlords desperate for any edge. A single horse could buy 10 prime slaves in Samarkand's markets, their reputation outweighing even their physical prowess. Tang dynasty records lament how entire trade caravans were hijacked just for these animals, their handlers found days later with throats torn open by something that left hoofprints in the blood. What lingers isn't just the horror, but the legacy. Modern DNA studies of Central Asian horse breeds reveal a genetic quirk, an abnormal aggression gene sequence absent in European or Arabian lines. Some herds in Kyrgyzstan still exhibit bizarre behaviors, like chewing on leather straps until they foam red. Whether nature or nurture shaped these beasts, the Silk Road's darkest truth remains. Even its most majestic creatures carried the whisper of something monstrous, bred into them mile by bloody mile. Under the foundations of Silk Road cities like Samarkand and Cotton, archaeologists have uncovered tiny bones that tell a monstrous story. Infants buried beneath gates and walls, their skeletons arranged with eerie precision. These weren't tragic accidents or hasty burials during plagues. The positioning speaks of intent, newborns placed at cardinal points under city gates, their skulls often crushed with ceremonial weights, their limbs bound in scarlet threads believed to ward off evil. A Kushan-era clay tablet from Bagram spells it out plainly. The gate drinks first, then the people. Not all scholars agree on interpretation. 19th century British archaeologists steeped in colonial arrogance dismissed these finds as native superstition, insisting the infants were stillborn or victims of exposure. Their reports often buried these discoveries in footnotes, more interested in cataloging gold hoards than confronting uncomfortable truths. But modern forensic technology reveals what those early excavators ignored. Bone analysis shows many victims were healthy, their remains bearing marks of ritual bleeding before death. At Peykand, a Sogdian fortress along the Zeravshan River, researchers found 47 infant skeletons beneath the eastern gate, each with a single rib removed and replaced with a carved jade animal. Carbon dating confirmed they died simultaneously during the city's construction in the 5th century. The practice wasn't isolated to Central Asia. Han Dynasty records describe gate taxes paid in living jade, a euphemism for children offered to earth spirits. A grisly parallel emerges in Cappadocia, where Hittite-era tunnels under Derinkuyu contain niches filled with infant bones alongside clay tablets invoking the watchers below. Even the Romans, despite their disdain for barbarian customs, documented Persian caravans sacrificing newborns at mountain passes, believing their cries would bind the wind demons. What chills the blood isn't just the acts themselves, but their cold calculation. Tax ledgers from Merv detailed payments to gate mothers or women who provided infants in exchange for silver, often listing ages and health like livestock. A 7th century Zoroastrian penitential text condemns the practice while admitting its prevalence, warning priests that no blessing comes from stone-fed blood. Modern excavations continue to unearth evidence that rewrites history. In 2018, ground-penetrating radar near Bukhara revealed a previously unknown subterranean chamber beneath the Ark fortress, its walls lined with infant-sized niches, their interiors stained with copper residue from long-decayed amulets. Local legends had spoken of the fortress's hungry shadow for centuries, but only now do we understand what truly lurked beneath the merchants' feet. The Silk Road's grand arches and mighty walls stood not just on stone and mortar, but on the silenced whimpers of the innocent, a debt written in bones no empire could ever repay. The Tarim Basin holds corpses that defy history, tall, red-haired men and women in Celtic plaids and felted wool, their faces frozen in time with unsettling clarity. These aren't the mummies you'd expect in Western China. Their features are distinctly European, their clothes woven in patterns matching Bronze Age Scandinavia, and they've lain in the blistering desert sands for over 4,000 years. The most famous, the Churchen Man, towers at 6 feet 6, his crimson tunic still bright as the day he was buried beside a woman with delicate braids and a baby wrapped in a goatskin shroud. Their existence shatters the narrative of an ethnically homogeneous ancient China, and that's precisely why their story remains one of archaeology's most contentious battles. When DNA tests in the 1990s confirmed the mummies' European ancestry, the implications sent shockwaves through academia. These weren't just lost travelers, they represented a thriving, forgotten civilization that predated Chinese dynasties by centuries. Their burial sites contained remnants of cheese, wheat, and medicinal herbs characteristic of the Eurasian steppe, not the millet-based diet of early East Asians. Even their language, deduced from inscriptions on wooden tablets, bore eerie similarities to Tocharian, an extinct Indo-European tongue. For historians, the Tarim mummies were a golden key to understanding prehistoric migration until politics intervened. The Chinese Communist Party, wary of fueling separatist sentiments in the Muslim-majority Xinjiang region where the mummies were found, abruptly restricted access to the sites. Foreign researchers had permits revoked, samples confiscated, and published papers scrubbed from Chinese academic databases. A 2010 documentary by the Discovery Channel, featuring interviews with scientists who'd studied the mummies, was banned mid-production. The official stance: these were early representatives of Chinese ethnic minorities, despite overwhelming genetic evidence to the contrary. The suppression grew so severe that a 2021 Harvard study using smuggled DNA samples had to be published under the cautious title, Bronze Age Populations of the Inner Asian Highlands, to avoid backlash. But the mummies themselves refused to be silenced. Forensic analysis reveals brutal truths hidden beneath their preserved skin. Deep axe wounds on male skeletons suggest violent skirmishes with neighboring tribes, while traces of opium and ephedra in their hair hint at ritual drug use. One female mummy, dubbed the Beauty of Lulan, died clutching a pouch of cannabis seeds, her lungs blackened by years of inhaling smoke. Their very bodies are time capsules of a lost world where East and West collided long before the Silk Road's official dawn. Why does their origin matter so fiercely? Because they rewrite the map of human movement. If steppe nomads could penetrate deep into what's now China 4 millennia ago, it means cultural exchange and conquest occurred on a scale we've barely begun to grasp. The CCP's resistance to this narrative isn't just about controlling history. It's about denying the profound foreign influences that shape the region. Meanwhile, the mummies' silent, sun-bleached faces seem to mock these efforts, their DNA a ticking clock on borrowed time. The sands that preserved them may yet outlast the ideologies trying to erase them. Deep in the caves of Dunhuang, where Buddhist scrolls piled to the ceiling, explorers stumbled upon something that shouldn't have existed: ancient Christian texts written in perfect Chinese, their pages whispering of a forgotten empire of faith. These were the Jesus Sutras, sacred scriptures of the Church of the East, a Christian sect that thrived along the Silk Road centuries before Europe's missionaries even dreamed of Asia. Their story isn't just one of religious exchange, it's a tale of cultural alchemy, political betrayal, and a faith that vanished so completely, its very existence feels like heresy against history itself. The Church of the East didn't just survive on the Silk Road, it reinvented Christianity for an Eastern world. Unlike the rigid doctrines of Rome or Constantinople, these Nestorian Christians blended their teachings with Buddhist humility, Taoist harmony, and even Zoroastrian symbolism. A 7th-century sutra discovered near Xi'an describes Jesus not as a crucified martyr, but as the luminous Buddha of healing. his parables retold with Chinese proverbs and his disciples renamed like Confucian sages. One fragment depicts the Virgin Mary cradling the infant Christ in a pose identical to Guanyin, the Buddhist goddess of mercy, a visual heresy that would have earned artists a burning in medieval Europe. But the real shock lies in how far they spread. Persian records describe Christian monasteries dotting the Taklamakan desert, their bells ringing alongside Buddhist gongs. A Tang dynasty edict from 635 grants permits to Dakin monks, the Chinese term for Roman Christians, to build chapels in Chang'an, while Uyghur manuscripts mention Christian scribes working alongside Muslim scholars in Kashgar's bazaars. For 3 glorious centuries, this was a faith without borders until the Silk Road's shifting politics turned against them. The church's downfall reads like divine tragedy. When the Tang dynasty collapsed in the 9th century, anti-foreign sentiment surged. Buddhist monks, once their allies, accused the Christians of stealing clouds, a poetic charge meaning they siphoned rainfall through dark magic. Imperial troops sacked monasteries, burning libraries and smashing altars carved with crosses wrapped in lotus flowers. The final blow came not from violence but neglect. As the Mongol Empire rose, the Church of the East became collateral in a theological war, too Christian for the Muslim Khans, too Eastern for the Catholic envoys arriving from Europe. Marco Polo's accounts of strange Christians who bowed to the wind were already ethnographic curiosities by his time. The Jesus Sutras themselves harbor one last mystery. Carbon dated to the 8th century, their ink contains traces of malachite and crushed pearls, luxuries only affordable to imperial patrons. Yet the handwriting shows signs of haste, as if scribes knew time was running out. Some passages end mid-sentence, their final characters bleeding into desperate smudges. The most haunting is Sutra 5, which abruptly shifts from a parable about fishing to a warning: the path narrows. Hold fast to the thread, though the mountain swallows your voice. Today, all that remains are fragments and whispers. A ruined monastery in Kyrgyzstan where frescoes of the Last Supper show disciples sitting cross-legged on bamboo mats. A Mongol princess's tombstone near Beijing inscribed with the Lord's Prayer in Syriac script, and those caves where the sutras survived not because they were treasured, but because someone sealed them away, hoping against hope that the road might one day circle back to reclaim them. It never did. The Silk Road giveth, and the Silk Road taketh away even from its holiest travelers. In the flickering candlelight of a forgotten Nestorian monastery near Turpan, a monk's trembling hand penned words that would outlast empires. When the iron birds grow silent and the jade gates close forever, the road will swallow its own children. This cryptic prophecy, scribbled in Syriac script on a scrap of mulberry paper, wasn't merely poetic doom, it foretold the Silk Road's most shocking vanishing act. The monk's vision came to pass with chilling precision in the 15th century, when China's Ming dynasty abruptly severed ties with the world, torching its navy and walling off the trade routes that had fueled its wealth. Overnight, the greatest economic network in history became a ghost road, its caravans left to rot in the sand. The Nestorians weren't alone in their dread. Persian astrologers recorded comets splitting the sky in the years before the Ming's retreat, interpreting them as the dragon's tail sweeping clean the earth. Byzantine merchants trading in Guangzhou told of eerie portents markets suddenly emptied of salt, a traditional Chinese symbol of preservation, while packs of feral camels gathered outside city gates as if awaiting an exodus. Even nature seemed to conspire. Tree rings from the Tian Shan Mountains show a decades-long, great dryness that choked the oasis towns, leaving wells brackish and fields barren. But the most damning evidence lies in the Ming imperial archives themselves. A recently decrypted edict from 1424 orders the destruction of all seafaring vessels over 300 tons, dismissing them as floating coffins for fools who chase the setting sun. Why would an empire at the peak of its power deliberately unravel its lifelines? The official narrative cites pirate threats and Mongol remnants, but ledgers from the Forbidden City's secret vaults tell a darker tale. Grain tax records show catastrophic harvests in the Yangtze Delta, while palace physicians' reports describe a mysterious black sweat plague decimating port cities. The Ming didn't just fear invasion, they were racing collapse. By walling off the Silk Road, they hoped to keep starvation and disease from pouring through the cracks in their empire. The fallout was catastrophic. Without Chinese silk and porcelain, Mediterranean markets imploded, triggering economic cascades that toppled sultans and bankrupted Italian banking houses. In Central Asia, entire cities built on transit fees starved as caravans dwindled. The Nestorian monk's prophecy had manifested with cruel irony. The road didn't just vanish, it consumed the civilizations it had birthed. Today, satellite imagery reveals abandoned caravanserais swallowed by dunes, their courtyards littered with the skeletons of merchants who waited for trains that never came. The Silk Road's final lesson: even the mightiest bridges burn when fear outruns ambition. From the bones of enslaved laborers crushed beneath silk shipments to the plague-ridden corpses hurled like projectiles in history's first biological warfare, the Silk Road was never just a route, it was a living, breathing paradox. A bridge between worlds, yes, but one drenched in blood, where empires rose on the backs of the nameless and vanished without a whisper. Think of the Sogdian merchants whose language was erased by conquest, the infants buried beneath city gates as offerings, the tantric monks who mummified themselves alive in search of enlightenment. Every bolt of silk, every jade amulet, every scrap of parchment carried unseen weight, the ghosts of those who paid the price for progress. The road's greatest trick was its duality. It spread Buddhism's compassion and the Black Death's carnage with equal efficiency. It birthed cities like Samarkand, glittering with mathematical and astronomical breakthroughs, while their foundations hid mass graves of those who built them. Its caravans carried Persian poetry and Greek philosophy alongside smallpox and slavery. For every Marco Polo who returned with tales of wonder, there were 1,000 souls left to rot in unmarked desert graves, their stories swallowed by the sands. And yet here's the cruelest twist: we wouldn't have the modern world without its horrors. The Renaissance was funded by Silk Road riches, the printing press invented to replicate Buddhist texts. Your morning coffee, a crop first traded along its routes. Even the concept of globalization was born in its bazaars. The road gave and took with the same hand, leaving humanity forever torn between gratitude and grief. So here's the question that lingers like smoke from a caravanserai's dying fire: would you have dared to travel it? Knowing the risks, bandits who flayed their victims alive, deserts that drove men to cannibalism, plagues that could erase a city in weeks, would you have gambled your life for silk, for spices, for the chance to glimpse a world beyond the horizon? Or would the whispers of its darkness have kept you anchored to the safety of home? The Silk Road doesn't just belong to history, it's a mirror, and what it reflects might unsettle you more than any ghost story ever could. If these shadows of the past gripped you, don't let the journey end here. Share your answer in the comments. Would you have braved the road? And for more untold tales of history's most haunting corners, tap that subscribe button. The next mystery is already